It's been another productive few days, gotten a lot done. Here's the latest update on the progress. First thing we did was the stringers. These are aluminum tubes that we had to cut to length and fit in both the aft and the fore section, and then they were drilled and riveted into place with glue. There's one on each side and also one on the bottom that's actually safety wired. They don't have any rivets on the bottom, I don't know why, or guides, but this allows for the fabric covering to have a nice edge around the fuselage. If you look up a picture, you'll see this sort of seam down the middle, and that's what the stringer is for. Anyway, pretty easy. Aluminum's easy to work with. It's soft. It drills really easily. So we got that cut, glued, and safety wired in place. We had to do that before we started working on the door frames. We did get the door frames in. More aluminum, soft, really easy to work with. This was a guess and check process. One of the things that wasn't very clear in the manual was the top pieces and the two back pieces of this little window are tapered. And it talks about one being tapered to the back, and I didn't quite get that. But this top piece has a wider front than back, as does the bottom piece has a wider front than back. And they're not actually the same on either side. So I hope that's not a big deal in the long run. The pieces weren't identical. But that allows for a little gap so that you can put a piece of, I guess it's plexiglass or acrylic into this window so that you can have a nice little window here. And then it lines up with the turtle deck, which is another piece of plexiglass that goes over the back and allows you to access the baggage compartment. But anyways, that frame comes all the way down into the front, and there's one more little piece that we can't glue in yet. Well, we can glue in now, but we couldn't glue in at the time that we were waiting on. I went ahead and came and put body filler on. That's what this blue stuff is. It hasn't been sanded yet, but it's on, and I'll be able to clean up all those sharp aluminum edges because this will all be covered. This is actually a fabric attach point if you really think about it. And apparently anything you can feel with your hands, you can feel through the fabric. I've never covered anything before, but I'm going to try and get it as smooth as possible. You definitely don't want the sharp aluminum to be poking out because that could tear through the fabric. I did that on both sides and got all the door frames in on either side. And I'm just waiting on a single little piece up in the front that said you had to wait. So just sort of put that off for the time being. Here's a little bit of a closer shot of the door frames. All these bends and curves have to be trimmed so that they line up. And you actually have to sort of pull these to get them to line up while you rivet them in place. And they're all glued, so they're really solid. But the aluminum takes a little bit of finagling to get it to be just right. But we were patient with it. It seems like we always work on the right side first, and the left side is always slightly better. So this side's a little bit cleaner. We had a template to go off of. That all the lengths on that side were cut so we could match it. But they're both good. Just this one is always a little bit better on the left side. I went ahead and took body fill and contoured with the body fill the ends of the elevator, the horizontal stabilizer, the vertical stabilizer, and the rudder. So I put this blue body filler on. We'll have to come back and sand it and get it to have a nice smooth contour. It's pretty unpleasant stuff to work with. It's kind of grainy. I actually like working with high sol better, but the high sol kind of runs. And this stuff's a lot easier to sand, I've noticed. But I've definitely gone through and contoured all the shapes and filled a lot of spots. You can see on the frame some of the little spots that have come through, and tried to add body filler so that we can come through with sandpaper and smooth all these out. And underneath the fabric, you won't even know that these edges are here as long as I can sit down there and sand it smooth. This is sort of finished work. I technically don't really have to do this right now, but there are some times when I'd rather get a project started so it can dry overnight and come back to it later on. See, now these are done. I can come and sand on them whenever I have a free moment. I won't have to wait for the sanding, or I won't have to wait for the body filler to dry. So this was a really easy, quick, maybe 20-minute project where I went through and got pretty much all those surfaces covered up. The next project we tried to work on was to mount this header tank, which goes right here. And as we were putting it in, we recognized that the seatbelt mounting tab, which is right here, points right into this right side wall of the header tank. And we went to go line up the seatbelt, and it would basically, according to the way it's supposed to be installed, it would run right into the side of the header tank. I ended up posting it on the forum, and Brandon from the actual Kitfox factory said that all you have to do is bend the seatbelt mounting tab up so that it fits right up on the side of the header tank. Some people were telling me to move the header tank. Fortunately, I haven't drilled any holes yet, so I can do a little bit of both. But I was worried that if I were to bend the seatbelt tab, would that structurally affect the seatbelt, or would it still be a functional seatbelt? Turns out that's what they do at the Kitfox factory. They just bend that tab up. The other thing is that all these fittings and plugs need to be coated with a thread sealer that they don't provide you, and it's kind of a specific thing to have. I was going to buy the cheaper stuff, but I wanted to buy one that was ethanol resistant because a lot of the engines that you can put on a Kitfox will burn just normal auto fuel that has ethanol in it. So you have to make sure that your lines are resistant to ethanol. So I went and bought the fancy ethanol resistant thread sealer. We installed the brake master cylinders on both the rudder pedals, both sets of rudder pedals. Pretty straightforward process. I found that even after mounting the springs here, which I don't think we had on in the last video, but I did mount these rudder springs, this right-hand side, I guess it would be, sorry, left-hand, left pedal is still rubbing. In fact, it's rubbing so much that it overcomes the spring tension. So I have it taped, and I'm going to pull this out. This eventually has to come out of the aircraft for this to get upholstered, but I'm going to pull it out. I've marked it for when I do pull it out. I'm going to have to sand that bearing down, even though I've already sanded all this stuff a bunch of times, and I already sent it to the machine shop. So this, I've tried to shim it and space it, and I've just decided that I'm going to have to just sand the play out of it so that it doesn't grab. Let's see, the outboard side on the right-hand side has a little bit of resistance as well, but it's enough for the spring. I should say it's not enough for the spring to have any issues pulling it back, but this one definitely does, so that has to have something done. It's on the docket. Another note I should talk about are the floorboards. I ended up installing rivet nuts instead of the factory recommended sheet metal screws, I guess is what they are. So I ended up drilling out the holes in the frame to a larger size so they could accommodate this rivet nut, which is a rivet that has threading on the inside. So you can insert it and permanently lock that nut into place and then drive just a machine screw all the way through. And that'll allow these panels to be removed really easily without basically peeling a sheet metal screw out every time. That would have been a much better and easier thing to do also on the seat pan, which if I had them, I would have done it. But definitely recommend those on the floorboards. It's not a stock option. You have to buy a rivet nut tool and a set of rivet nuts that are the right size. But definitely worth it because these will be super easy to just zap in and out, and I won't wear out the wood or the metal below if I just use those. That is way better than what the factory recommends and makes it just easier both from an installation standpoint and from an inspection standpoint down the road. I guess it's time to talk about the elephant in the room. I did put this thing on wheels, and these things are so much bigger when they get air in them than when they're empty. We inflated them up to a very low 5 psi, so these will actually take more air and expand even maybe a little bit more. But man, they got so much bigger. It's pretty impressive how actually large these tires are. We had to put the wheels on these babies, which was pretty difficult because the two sides of the wheel hub slide into either side of the wheel, and the bolts that they give you are not long enough to squeeze the actual two sides together. So we ended up getting a long bolt that we ran through and could get a bolt on the other side of the threads just to squeeze it in enough to get bolts on the other threads. We definitely got our monster shock gear in. That was a must. This required us to re-drill some of the holes in the actual landing gear because it was sized originally for the smaller set of gear, but these had a bigger hole on it and a much beefier bolt. So we ended up re-drilling and reaming the holes on all the attach points for these shock monsters, and then had to sort of adjust the spacing on the washers to actually get it into place. But once we did that, we got the axles in and then actually put it on wheels for the first time, which was pretty exciting. It looks, I mean, I thought it looked like a plane when we put the seats in, but then you put it actually on the wheels and it comes to life, especially once it's standing on its own 3 feet, as I say. But we got this in, definitely a process. There was a lot of grinding. These, I guess, main gear struts didn't quite fit into the slots. We had to grind powder coat off. And as I mentioned, we had to re-drill holes. Just standard, seems to be standard kit building stuff. Nothing will fit the first time. So you got to drill it and ream it so that it fits. So we had to go through that process. And these are just on temporarily. Now, it's not normal to put wheels on, but I figured, one, I can go through all the boxes and get things out, and I can get all the hardware together, and it limits the amount of parts that I'm going through every time I look for stuff. This kit actually was pretty well put together. They forgot to send me a set of castle nuts, but fortunately I had a backup set of nuts here that would have worked. But I wanted it to stand on its own wheels, just because it's a good working, I guess I should say rolling workbench. We were able to move it around the shop pretty easily on these things, easier than it is on horses, because otherwise you'd have to move the horse every time you move the plane. Now you can move the whole plane and it stands on its own. So I got the tail wheel on as well, and we can swing it around pretty easily. With the wings on, obviously, it doesn't fit anywhere, but this has made it a lot easier to actually work on. The downside to putting it on wheels this early is that the wings are now really high. So now that we're working on the wings, we have to get up on step stools to get on top of it. So I honestly want to get a smaller set of wheels just to roll it around. You actually see people doing that, and in the factory they have them all on smaller wheels just because it's easier to work on. But I'm actually happy with having it on gear for the time being. And it's just really exciting to see it have its own stance and structure so that it isn't looking like, again, a skeleton sitting on a set of sawhorses. Before we could start working on the wings, I actually had to finish a project that I started a while ago, which is this wing rotisserie. I welded these up, and I've used it's a functional engine mount stand. The base of this has this box beam insert that had another attachment that slid in and held an engine. What I did was I just took a piece of, I guess this is 2-inch box beam, and welded a piece of angle iron on it so that it fits right in there, because this is a specifically milled size and I couldn't find it at the metal supply shop. So I just got the smaller one and sized it up with angle iron, and then welded a piece of 2-inch pipe onto there, then welded these bolts and little screws through, and the PVC pipe rotisserie fits right in here, and I can roll these around. They're pretty sturdy, they're solid at the base, so they're not going to tip, and they also don't flex at all. People usually build these out of wood, and I still have the material to build it out of wood, but I had this rolling around in the shop, fortunately, and was able to repurpose this simple base into a functional rotisserie. The perks of having this metal one is that later on down the road, when I want to hold the fuselage, it'll be structurally strong enough to hold the fuselage. And I actually have this metal pipe that slides in there also really well, so I'll be able to weld a mount for the fuselage, so this whole rotisserie will function just as well for the fuselage. Guess I should show you how this actually slides in here. It just is a piece of PVC that we put T's and elbows on, and these extensions go into the end of the wing, and we can put the wing between two of these and spin it around and lock it in place so it doesn't move. Incredibly useful. If we didn't have it, working on the wings would be so much more difficult. We usually start everything on the right side. That just has been the trend, but with the wing, we actually started on the left side. That's because it was closer to the door, and logistically it just made more sense to get this left wing in and dealt with. We had to move this whole, once we got it on wheels, we had to move this whole fuselage over because we couldn't have fit the wing in its original spot. So we ended up moving a lot of stuff around and finagled it in here so that we have both a walking path and enough space for both wings. That actually took a lot of time clearing boxes and things out. But we got the wing up and on. The instructions for this were so vague. I got the quick build wing and the factory pre-rig. Those two things are, first, they build this entire wing structure for you. That includes inserting an aluminum spar and riveting it in place, and then riveting or lining up, gluing, and riveting all these other parts that go inside of it, including your lift struts. We'll get to that. So the instructions tell you to skip through to step 12, and then they put you out on step 12 and tell you to do a few things that are totally unnecessary because they've already done them for you. So for this left one, we got it up, got it rigged, we got it on there, we read the instructions, and there was nothing we could do. They've already drilled the holes for us, and they'd already lined it up. So we thought, why did we go through the whole process of putting it on there? We could have just jumped right to the actual lift strut attach points. So that's what we did on the other side. The actual attach points are these two bolt holes up on the top. And in the manual, it says to grind the top of the bushing tube so that it shapes and fits the doubler shape. They say that you should cut a hole in a piece of wood. Well, I just thought if I'm going to take the doublers, I can just line them up so that I can contour what's actually going to go on the frame. So I just lined it up and contoured it to the doublers. That ended up not working in the long run because we didn't have the length right. Once we did get the doublers on, I actually had to grind off a lot more to get them to slide on and off really smoothly. So I wish I would have known that from the start and we wouldn't have struggled so hard to get these on and off. These wings, they fold, so this thing swings back, but coming on and off is not easy. You have to get these 3 points basically to line up. Not to mention the actual attachment points take some wiggling and sort of maneuvering around to get it to be just right. So just a lot of work to get these things on and off. We're trying to get as much done as we can with it on the fuselage before we take it off again, sort of reading through the manual to see what steps come up, because taking it on and off is just really difficult. I put this on there so that when I file these metal pieces down, I don't end up scratching the rest of the frame. This is just a little bit of protection. But here are the two attachment points a little closer up. The wing actually pivots on this back one. That's where it swings all the way out. And this one just has a safety pin on it. And the whole clevis pin will remove pretty easily and the wing will swing around. So as I said, once we put the doublers on, which are these metal strips, it didn't quite want to go on there. So we had to take off a little bit more material off the top and the bottom and then recontour it so that it slid easily. I wanted the wings to be pretty easily to take on and off because this is supposed to be foldable in, as they say, 10 minutes. But if I'm sitting there struggling with a bolt for 10 minutes, then it's not going to take 10 minutes. So I spent a little bit of extra time making that pretty smooth. I'm not sure if I'm supposed to powder coat it. It doesn't say anything about that in the manual, but we'll get there later on down the road. I actually just got some epoxy primer today that I can go through and touch up some of the nicks and scrapes that I've put on this thing throughout just the moving and building process. Another trick, this is the fish eye, or they call it a fish mouth, where the actual strut mounts to the fuselage. This is really stiff, so we ended up greasing it so that the whole thing slides on and off better, and it makes 100 times the difference. Before we actually got the wing up, we had to put these lift strut attachment points on. They had already been pre-drilled because I had the factory pre-rig option. So as I mentioned, these were already lined up and drawn and drilled, pre-drilled for me, as well as the holes in the actual end of the spars. So we thought that we had to remeasure everything, and we could have gone back and rechecked it, but it was perfect. So we could have just drilled these in from the start and not messed around with putting it on and taking it off for the first time. This process is 84 rivets per side, plus another 14 rivets per doubler on the side. So it ended up being 240 plus rivets in a day, which my arms feel like they're jello. And I actually had to do some rivets today that just, I could feel how hard I was pulling all day, because these are deep rivets too and pretty hard to pull. Anyway, we got these in. It was a lot of drilling. You just drilling for a solid hour to get all these holes put in. We did get them put in place. Once we got them in, we were worried that they were off, but we were just sort of installing them wrong. There are two of them, so these eyelets come in. As we normally put things in, you usually put one bolt in to hold it in place, and then you slide the other one in. That won't work for this. You have to slide them both in simultaneously, and then slides the bolts in. It took us quite some time to figure that out, and a lot of angling, and again, the manual gives you no help on this stuff, so you have to figure it out on your own. I wish I would have saved a lot, known this before, because I would have saved a lot of time. And fortunately, we did save a lot of time on the right side, because we had gone through and made a lot of these revelations about how to install it. But we did get this in and glued, as well as those doubler strips that actually reinforce the attachment point of the spar. Just a lot of riveting and gluing, but they're in and they're mounted. We did the same thing for the other side of the plane. This side went a lot faster because we knew what we were doing and we didn't screw around putting the wings on the plane first. We just put these in, figured we weren't going to move them anyway because they'd already been pre-drilled, and then pilot drilled and riveted all these, a bunch of rivets again. The other thing that we did was we left the foam on, and that's just another extra layer of protection because everything sort of gets bounced and bumped around in here. Not badly, but enough to sort of scrape powder coat here and there. So I'm trying to keep as much foam on as possible just to keep her safe. Here's a little better close-up of the doublers here. This is the reinforcement plate on the bottom, and then on the top, and the bolt hole. The clevis pin goes right through the middle of it. You had to actually glue one on the inside and on the top. And this was the reason why we couldn't get the wing on correctly the second time, because this actually added a lot of internal thickness. We had to sand down the top and bottom of that mounting bushing that's actually mounted to the fuselage to get this thing to slide on. Once we did that, this thing slides on really smoothly and easily, and I could see how you could take the wings and fold them back within 10 minutes. We ended up gluing these number 1 rivets in place since we had the wing up for the first time. We varnished them already and have them up and glued in place. They're still drying. They're probably cured by now, but we're going to let them sit overnight. In order to get these to hold in place, I took clamps and big flat pieces of wood, as well as a ruler to get the measurement right. So I just clamped the ruler in place so I could make sure that it was fixed distance. I had to make sure that the bottom end didn't flex because this could tilt. So actually on the other side it was misbehaving, so I had to clamp it on the top and the bottom. This number 1 rib, now that I have it in place, I can put the transition ribs in and then the butt rib in that actually attaches to the plane. The last thing we ended up working on, which was a huge effort and incredibly exhausting. I'm actually really tired right now. We spent almost half the day getting these jerry struts lined up. The manual is, again, a little bit vague. You have to do a little bit of guesswork on what it says to do, but I did actually do something out of order. I drilled these holes sooner than I should have on the actual jerry strut mounting brackets, but it was not anything that was unrecoverable. It just took us a little bit longer to get these mounted. The first step was to put masking tape on the actual spars so that the clamps don't rub when you mount them, because they're these nasty metal clamps. I actually mounted them 4 different times because I put them in the spot that it said, and then that didn't work, so I put them up higher. That didn't work, so I put them down lower, and it ended up being the last possible place in between the 2 gaps. I should have just wrapped the whole wing way more than I actually needed, and I would have saved myself a ton of time and energy just retaping. It seems like a little thing, but you get it done and you end up saying, wow, am I really taping again? I thought I just had that taken care of. So we did get that done. We had issues with the clamps, and it's another hardware issue that I'm not really sure that I can solve. But you can see these things are all pretty janky. They're different sizes, even though they're all the same part number, and they don't line up. And these guys are too long on the front, so that it doesn't clamp very tight. And the rear ones are too short, so you can't actually get a bolt through them to clamp them in place. So I either have to get longer hardware, which I'm going to obviously ask Kitfox to replace. I've already put a post up. Or I either need new clamps, because the bending work is just hit and miss on these. You never really know where it's going to line on the actual strut. So we spent a lot of time fiddling around with these and getting the right. I actually had to scavenge hardware from another portion of the kit just so I could fit this. But once we got that done, we had to plumb this up and make sure that they were straight up and down with the floor, or actually the level of the fuselage. So we actually leveled the airplane before we did this. And then it was just moving it back and forth a 32nd or 16th of an inch until we got it straight up and down. And every time you moved it, the struts would bow maybe a little bit, so you had to relieve the pressure. And then the other side would move a little bit. So the left side took a lot longer than the right, and it just required a lot of patience moving it back and forth to get them to be just right. But now that they are aligned up, I feel a lot better about taking that extra time to make sure that that was just right. And both Jack and myself are just so tired from wiggling this thing around and also trying to get the wing to fit. The wings are pretty exhausting. It's a lot of overhead work, especially the way that we have this mounted. It's up high. Now, sure, you could put it down on horses that would be lower, but you'd still be moving around these big cumbersome objects, and you have to be very focused so that you don't dent or ding anything around the walls of the shop or just against the rest of the plane. So the wings are a pretty demanding process. Just taking them on and off is a chore, and it requires two people. You have to have a second person to do it. I mean, maybe you could do it if you made a bunch of jigs, but the way that I have it, you'd be crazy to try and do it by yourself. And I sometimes would appreciate a third person, which would help sort of hold something in place while you're trying to get a bolt through. But we got the jury struts done. And the next thing we'll do is take the wings off and get the last ribs on. And then hopefully I can just pull these things off and not have to put them on again, because it's just such a pain to take them on and off. One thing I forgot to show you was the T3 tail spring, which is pretty gnarly. That was easy enough to get on. I mean, the bolts just sort of slide in place. It's just sort of a factory plug-in part that they make for most planes. It's a standard spacing, I think, on the bolts. Of course, we had to ream like everything, but a super beefy tail spring, a huge coil. Sorry, my camera did die, so I had to pull out my secondary backup camera, so it's not exactly the most ideal thing to happen, but I got it done. I wish I could do these updates more often so they wouldn't be as long, but it takes a lot of work to both work on the plane and then also film. So I'm not really filming the process, as I mentioned before in another video, which if you haven't seen, you should check that out. But filming a lot of this stuff would be boring. I could do how-tos, but there are plenty of those on the internet. A lot of these tips are helpful maybe if you're doing this yourself. In fact, I would say that I learned a ton just from watching one guy named Project Kitfox. I think his name is Brian Bowen, but he does a great job at giving you those little tips that the manual doesn't quite cover, because the manual is one of the things that I love and hate about this kit. It's great where it's great, and where it's not great, it's miserable, and it sometimes misleads you. So having these videos that Brian made makes my day a lot easier. And I also found two other guys that got their kits maybe like a week or so before mine. In fact, when I was at the factory, Brandon said that he had just delivered them. He said he'd driven to Virginia to deliver a kit, and they had just sent one to Alaska. So these two guys got their kits right about the same time as I did, and they both have updates videos going on, and we're both conveniently about in the same place. So I recommend you guys go check out what they're up to just so you can compare. I'm learning little things from them. One trick I learned just from the comments was how to make these really nice structural fillets on the high saw. You dip your finger in denatured alcohol and rub it right around the edge, and it gives you these really nice smooth edges. I wish I knew that at the beginning. So all these little tips helped me when I was building. So I'm hoping that other people can maybe get an idea of the issues that I run into. And for those of you who are not watching this to build, I hope you're getting a good idea of what it's like for me to build my own plane. I do have a second person working on this with me, which helps a lot. I don't know how people do this themselves, and other people on YouTube, you don't see other people working on it with them, and it makes me wonder, how the heck do you do this? But holding things in place, helping maneuver big parts around, helping with the gluing process. I mean, because you're going to have your hands covered in high sol, or just a little bit of high sol, and you're gonna have to go through and touch your tools and things like that while you're doing it. So having that second person there speeds up the process and just makes it in general a lot more pleasant and easier. And also when you get to those really difficult, troublesome spots, then you don't feel so bad, and you have sort of somebody to take your stress out on, and you can sort of joke about how, oh, classic Kitfox sending you a crooked clamp or whatever it may be. But all in all, I get more excited about flying this thing every time I work at it, especially now that we have the wings and wheels on and it actually looks like a flying machine. The excitement's still there, so it's all going great. That wraps up the update for the day. Got a lot done. Definitely pretty tired. Those jury struts took a lot out of me. Still in the same position where the process takes a little bit of patience. I keep running into these hardware issues that are not the end of the world, but it would be ideal if I didn't have to run into them in the first place. I would have expected some of that stuff to be ironed out at this point in time in the 7th iteration of this kit. So that's our latest update. So thanks for watching. Hope you enjoy it.